Welcome, dear listeners, to a delightful mystery set in the charming village of St. Mary Mead. In Murder at the Livestock Auction, a Miss Marple mystery, our beloved elderly sleuth, Miss Jane Marple, unravels a puzzling crime with her keen eye for human nature. Settle in with a cup of tea and let's step into a world of cozy intrigue where secrets hide in plain sight.
Chapter 1. The Auction's Dark Turn. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in golden light. It was a crisp autumn day in the 1940s, and the annual livestock auction had the whole place buzzing. Farmers in worn caps and muddy boots trudged across the market square, their voices mixing with the bleats of sheep and the low moos of cattle. The air smelled of hay, damp earth, and the sharp tang of livestock. Stalls lined the square, selling hot tea, fresh buns, and knitted scarves, while children darted between legs, giggling and chasing stray chickens. The auction was more than a sale. It was a grand village party, where everyone swapped stories, settled debts, and showed off their best animals. Miss Jane Marple sat on a wooden bench near the cattle barn, her knitting needles clicking softly. Her gray hair was tucked neatly under a sensible hat, and her sharp blue eyes scanned the crowd. She wore a woolen shawl over her shoulders, her fingers nimble despite her age. To most, she was just a sweet old lady, fond of gossip and tea. But those who knew her better, like the vicar or Mrs. Price at the post office, understood Miss Marple missed nothing. Every glance, every whisper, every nervous twitch landed in her mind, like stitches in a pattern. She watched Tom Carver, the auctioneer's apprentice, hurry past with a clipboard. The lanky boy, barely 20, had flushed cheeks and a nervous way of moving, like a colt not yet steady on its legs. His dark hair stuck to his forehead, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting trouble. Miss Marple's needles slowed. "Young Tom's in a state," she murmured to herself, "not his usual self." Nearby, Mrs. Eliza Dalloway stood by her butcher's stall, her arms crossed tightly. Her round face, usually cheerful, was pinched with worry. She snapped at a customer asking for lamb chops, her voice sharp as a knife. Miss Marple tilted her head. Eliza's apron was smudged with more than the usual bloodstains. There was a streak of mud, too, fresh and dark. Now that's odd, Miss Marple thought. Eliza's too neat for such a mess. The auctioneer, Mr. Grayson, stood on a wooden platform, his voice booming as he called out bids for a pair of shaggy ewes. The crowd pressed closer, farmers raising hands or nodding to signal their offers. Reginald Potts, a wealthy livestock trader, leaned against a fence, watching with a smug grin. His tailored coat and polished boots set him apart from the rougher villagers. Potts was known for his sharp deals. Some said too sharp. He'd made more than a few enemies by outbidding rivals or driving hard bargains. Miss Marple noted his sly glance at Harold Finch, another trader, who glared back with a face like thunder. Bad blood there, she thought, her needles clicking again. The morning rolled on, lively and loud. A farmer's wife offered Miss Marple a scone, which she accepted with a smile, though her eyes never stopped roaming. She saw Clara Henshaw, the village spinster, hovering near the sheep pens. Clara, thin and pale in her faded dress, clutched a handkerchief, her knuckles white. She kept her distance from Potts, but her eyes flicked toward him, sharp and fearful. Miss Marple tucked that away. Claire is not one for auctions, she mused. What's brought her here? Then it happened. A scream, high and sharp, cut through the chatter. The crowd froze. It came from the cattle barn, a shadowy building stacked with hay bales and smelling of manure. Miss Marple's needles stopped. She set her knitting in her lap and rose, moving with surprising speed for her age. Others rushed toward the barn, their boots thumping on the packed earth. Constable Harrow, a sturdy man with a red face, pushed through, shouting for calm. Inside the barn the air was thick with dust and the sweet smell of hay. There, sprawled beside a bale, lay Reginald Potts. His fine coat was crumpled, his face pale as chalk. A pitchfork, its tines gleaming with fresh blood, was lodged in his chest. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman, Mrs. Gibbs from the post office, clutched her shawl and whispered, "Murder!" Constable Harrow knelt beside the body, his face grim. "Nobody touch anything," he barked. "This is a crime scene." Miss Marple slipped into the barn, unnoticed in the chaos. She stood near the back, her small frame half hidden by a stack of crates. Her eyes swept the scene. Potts's hand was outstretched, as if reaching for something. His coat pocket was torn, a scrap of paper just visible inside. Near his feet, a muddy boot print marked the dirt floor, too small for a man's, Miss Marple thought. She also spotted a glint in the hay, a brass button torn from a coat. She didn't touch it, but fixed its place in her mind. Constable Harrow stood, wiping his brow. "Reginald Potts is dead," he said, "stabbed with that pitchfork plain as day. Whoever did this knew what they were about." The crowd murmured, some backing away, others craning for a better look. Tom Carver stood frozen near the barn door, his clipboard trebling in his hands. Eliza Dalloway lingered at the edge, her face pale. Harold Finch was nowhere to be seen, and Clara Henshaw had slipped away in the commotion. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes on the pitchfork. Its wooden handle was worn but clean, except for faint scratches near the top, as if someone with a ring had gripped it tightly. "Curious," she said softly. She glanced at the crowd, noting their faces, fear, shock, and, in some, a flicker of something else, relief perhaps. "People," she murmured, "are so very predictable." Constable Harrow began shooing folks out of the barn. "Go on, back to your business. I'll need statements from anyone who saw Potts this morning." The villagers shuffled out, whispering. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her mind already turning. She thought of Tom's nervous glances, Eliza's muddy apron, Harold's glare, and Clara's fearful eyes. Each was a thread in a pattern, and Miss Marple was very good at patterns. As she stepped into the sunlight, she saw the auction had stopped. Farmers stood in clumps, talking in low voices. The children had vanished, likely sent home by worried mothers. The square, so lively an hour ago, felt heavy with secrets. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and walked toward the Blue Boar Inn, where she knew the real gossip would start. A murder at the livestock auction, she thought. How untidy! She settled at a corner table in the inn, her knitting back in her hands. The barmaid, Jenny, brought her a pot of tea, her eyes wide. "Did you see it, Miss Marple? Poor Mr. Potts stabbed like that." Miss Marple nodded, pouring her tea. "A dreadful thing, Jenny. But I'm sure the truth will come out. It always does." Jenny leaned closer. "They're saying Tom Carver had a row with Potts last week. Something about money." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "People say many things," she said. "Best to listen carefully." She thought of the boot print, the button, the scratches. Small things, everyday things, but to Miss Marple they were like words in a story. And she intended to read that story to the end. As the inn filled with villagers, their voices a low hum, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She listened to the chatter, picking out names: Tom, Eliza, Harold, Clara. Each had a reason to dislike Potts. She knew. He'd been a hard man, quick to make enemies. But which one, she wondered, had been desperate enough to kill? And why a pitchfork? So clumsy and cruel. She smiled faintly. The answer, she thought, is always in the little things. Outside the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead. The auction was over, but the mystery had just begun. Miss Marple finished her tea, tucked her knitting into her bag, and stood. There was work to be done. Quiet, careful work, and she was just the person to do it.
Chapter 2. The Suspects Assemble. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, but the lively buzz of the livestock auction had faded. The market square, still scattered with hay and hoofprints, felt quiet, almost heavy, as villagers whispered about the morning's grim discovery. Miss Jane Marple sat at her usual corner table in the Blue Boar Inn, her knitting needles clicking like a steady heartbeat. Her teacup steamed gently, and her sharp blue eyes flicked toward the door each time it swung open. The inn was the heart of village gossip, and Miss Marple knew that's where secrets would start to spill. Constable Harrow had taken charge, his broad shoulders filling the barn doorway as he questioned those closest to the late Reginald Potts. The pitchfork murder had shaken the village, and 4 names floated on everyone's lips. Miss Marple listened as Jenny, the barmaid, leaned over the counter, her voice low. "They're saying it's one of them who did it, Miss Marple. Tom Carver, Eliza Dalloway, Harold Finch, or that quiet Clara Henshaw. All had reasons to hate Potts." Miss Marple nodded, her face kind but her mind sharp. "People often have reasons, Jenny. It's the doing that matters." She sipped her tea, thinking of the muddy boot print, the brass button, and the scratches on the pitchfork's handle. Small things, but they told a story. She just needed to read it right. First was Tom Carver, the auctioneer's apprentice. The boy, barely 20, had a lanky frame and a nervous stutter that worsened when eyes were on him. He stood outside the inn now, clutching his clipboard, his dark hair falling into his eyes. Miss Marple watched him through the window, noting how he kept glancing at the barn, as if it might swallow him whole. Gossip said Tom had accused Potts of skimming auction fees, a serious charge for a lad hoping to make his way. "Young Tom's scared," Miss Marple murmured, "but is it guilt or just nerves?" Next was Mrs. Eliza Dalloway, the butcher's wife. She was bustling behind her stall again, though her usual smile was gone. Her round face was pale, and her hands moved too quickly, dropping a knife with a clatter when a customer asked about beef. Miss Marple had seen her earlier, her apron streaked with mud alongside the usual bloodstains. Eliza owed Potts money for cattle, and they'd argued loudly last week. Money troubles make people desperate, Miss Marple thought, her needles pausing. But desperate enough to kill? Then there was Mr. Harold Finch, a rival livestock trader. He was a burly man with a loud laugh, but today he stood alone by the sheep pens, his face dark. Potts had outbid him for a prize bull at the last year's auction, costing Harold a small fortune. Miss Marple recalled the brass button in the barn. Harold's coat had one missing when she'd seen him earlier, though he'd polished his boots to a shine. Trying to cover something, perhaps? She wondered. His temper was no secret, and grudges grew deep in St. Mary Mead. Finally, there was Miss Clara Henshaw, the village spinster. Thin and pale, with a faded dress and a nervous habit of twisting her handkerchief, Clara was rarely seen at auctions. Yet she'd been there this morning, her eyes fixed on Potts with a look Miss Marple recognized, fear mixed with anger. Clara passed the inn's window now, her steps quick, her hands trembling. Rumor had it she'd argued with Potts days ago, something about a family matter. Miss Marple tilted her head. Clara's hiding something, she thought, but what? The inn door creaked open, and Constable Harrow strode in, his face red from the cold. He nodded to Miss Marple before joining a group of farmers at the bar. "We're questioning everyone who saw Potts this morning," he said, loud enough for her to hear. "Tom Carver was in the barn early, and Eliza Dalloway was seen near it too. Harold Finch claims he was with his sheep, but no one can confirm it. And Clara Henshaw, well, she's not saying much." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sorting the pieces. She decided to take a closer look at the barn herself. Tucking her knitting into her bag, she thanked Jenny and stepped into the chilly square. The barn loomed ahead, its wooden walls weathered but sturdy. Constable Harrow had roped off the entrance, but Miss Marple slipped around the side, where a narrow path led to a smaller door. No one noticed her. She was just a little old lady after all. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and animals. The spot where Potts had fallen was marked by a dark stain on the dirt floor. Miss Marple crouched, careful not to touch anything. The muddy boot print was still there, small and distinct, not like the heavy tread of a farmer's boot. She studied it, her lips pursed. A woman's boot, perhaps, she thought, or a man with small feet. Nearby, the brass button glinted in the hay. She didn't pick it up, but noted its place, close to the torn pocket of Potts' coat. She moved to the pitchfork, now propped against a bale. The scratches on the handle caught her eye again, faint but clear, like marks from a ring. "Someone gripped this hard," she murmured. She glanced around, noticing a faint trail of hay leading to the side door. It was disturbed, as if someone had hurried out. In a rush to leave, she thought, or to hide? Back at the end, Miss Marple settled in her chair, her knitting resumed. Jenny brought a fresh pot of tea, eager to talk. "They're saying Tom had a sack of coins hidden in his room," she whispered. "Maybe he stole from Potts and got caught." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Gossip is like a quilt, Jenny. Lots of patches, but you need the right thread to hold it together." She thought of the suspects again. Tom's nervous glances could mean guilt or just fear of being blamed. Eliza's muddy apron and sharp temper hinted at something more than a bad day. Harold's missing button and polished boots suggested he was covering his tracks. And Clara, her fear of Potts was plain, but her frail frame didn't seem strong enough for a pitchfork. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. 4 people, 4 reasons, she thought, but only one truth. As the inn filled with villagers, their voices low and anxious, Miss Marple listened. A farmer mentioned seeing Eliza near the barn before the auction, carrying a heavy basket. Another said Harold had been drinking late at the pub the night before, muttering about Potts. And Mrs. Price, the postmistress, claimed Clara had delivered a letter to Potts last week, her face pale as she handed it over. A letter, Miss Marple thought, that's worth knowing.
Chapter 3. Whispers and Clues. The morning after the livestock auction murder, St. Mary Mead hummed with nervous chatter. The market square, now cleared of stalls and animals, felt empty, like a stage after a play. Miss Jane Marple walked slowly down the high street, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. Her sensible shoes tapped the cobblestones, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. A child's dropped mitten, a shopkeeper's hasty glance, a curtain twitching in a window. The village was on edge, and Miss Marple knew that's when secrets slipped out. She stopped at the post office, where Mrs. Gibbs, the postmistress, was sorting letters with a frown. "Morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Gibbs said, her voice low. "Dreadful business, that murder. Poor Mr. Potts, stabbed like a pig." Miss Marple nodded, her face kind, but her mind racing. "Dreadful, indeed. Have you heard anything unusual?" Mrs. Gibbs leaned closer, eager to share. "Well, I saw young Tom Carver near the barn before the auction. He had a sack that clinked, like coins. Odd, don't you think?" Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. "Very odd," she said. "Anything else?" Mrs. Gibbs hesitated, then whispered. "Clara Henshaw was here last week, posting a letter to Potts. She looked scared, like she'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside, her thoughts on Tom's clinking sack and Clara's letter. "Small things," she murmured, "but they add up." Next, she visited the butcher's shop, where Mrs. Eliza Dalloway was slicing meat with quick, jerky cuts. Her round face was pale, and her eyes darted to the door every few seconds. When a customer asked for sausages, Eliza snapped, "Can't you see I'm busy?" Miss Marple, browsing the counter, noticed Eliza's apron, still streaked with mud, and now a faint reddish stain that wasn't quite blood. "Good morning, Eliza," Miss Marple said softly. "A trying day, isn't it?" Eliza flinched, her knife pausing. "Trying? It's awful. That Potts business has everyone jumpy." Miss Marple smiled. "You were at the auction early, weren't you? Must be hard with all this talk." Eliza's hands shook, and a small cut on her finger caught Miss Marple's eye. Fresh, like it came from something sharp. "Just delivering meat," she muttered. "Nothing more." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind noted the cut, the mud, the nerves. "Eliza's hiding something," she thought as she left. "But is it murder?" She wandered back to the market square, where the barn stood quiet under a gray sky. Constable Harrow was gone, but a rope still blocked the entrance. Miss Marple slipped around to the side door, her small frame unnoticed by passers-by. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of hay.
The muddy boot print was still there, small and clear in the dirt. She crouched, studying it. Too small for Harold Finch, she thought. Maybe Eliza's, but she wears clogs in the shop. The brass button was gone, likely taken by Harrow, but she recalled its place near Potts's torn pocket. Then she saw something new, a scrap of paper, half buried in the hay. She eased it out with a knitting needle, careful not to touch it. It was torn, with spidery handwriting that read, "Pay by Friday, or I tell." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Blackmail," she said softly. "How tiresome." The handwriting looked like Clara Henshaw's. She'd seen it on church donation lists. But Clara's tiny feet didn't match the boot print. Someone else was here, Miss Marple thought. She tucked the paper back and stepped outside, her shawl tight against the breeze. At the village shop, she bought a ball of wool, chatting with the shopkeeper. Clara Henshaw was in yesterday, bought linseed oil of all things, said it was for polishing furniture, but her hands were shaking. Miss Marple nodded. Linseed oil could polish wood or clean a pitchfork handle. Clara's not herself, she thought. Later, at the Blue Boar Inn, Miss Marple sipped tea and listened to the gossip. A farmer mentioned seeing Harold Finch near the barn at dawn, polishing his boots by the pump. "Strange time for it," the farmer said. Miss Marple recalled Harold's coat, missing a brass button. He's covering his tracks, she thought. But why? She also heard that Tom Carver had been seen arguing with Potts last week, his voice loud about unfair pay. And Eliza had been late paying Potts for cattle, her temper flaring when he pressed her. Miss Marple's needles clicked as she sat by the inn's fire. The murder was a puzzle, but she was good at puzzles. The boot print, the button, the scratches, the letter, all pointed somewhere. People think they can hide things, she thought, smiling faintly. But the truth always shows. She'd keep watching, listening, and knitting. The pattern was there, waiting to be found.
Chapter 4. A False Scent. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the quiet village. 2 days after Reginald Potts's murder, the market square was empty, save for a few stray bits of hay tumbling in the breeze. Miss Jane Marple walked slowly toward the church, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Her sharp eyes scanned the cobblestones, noting a villager's hurried glance or a curtain flicked aside. The murder had everyone on edge, and Miss Marple knew nervous people made mistakes. At the Blue Boar Inn, Constable Harrow was busy. He'd zeroed in on Tom Carver, the young auctioneer's apprentice, as his main suspect. Gossip buzzed like flies. Tom had been seen arguing with Potts, and a sack of coins found in his room looked bad. "It's open and shut," Harrow told a group of farmers over a pint. "The lad stole from Potts, got caught, and used that pitchfork in a panic." Miss Marple, sipping tea in her corner, shook her head slightly. "Youthful nerves," she murmured, "aren't the same as guilt." She'd seen Tom that morning, his lanky frame hunched by the village pump, his face pale. He'd stammered when a farmer asked him about the coins, saying they were his savings, not stolen. Miss Marple's needles clicked in her mind. The boy was scared, but his eyes didn't have the look of a killer. She thought of the muddy boot print in the barn, too small for Tom's large feet. Not him, she decided, but she needed more to be sure. Miss Marple headed to the barn again, slipping past the rope Constable Harrow had left up. The air inside was cool, smelling of hay and earth. The dark stain where Potts had fallen was still there, and the boot print remained, clear in the dirt. She studied it, her lips pursed. A woman's boot, maybe,
Or a man with small feet, she thought. The brass button was gone, taken by Harrow, but she recalled its spot near Potts's torn pocket. Then she noticed something new. A faint trail of hay leading to the side door, disturbed as if someone had rushed out. In a hurry, she murmured, hiding something. She stepped outside and saw Harold Finch across the square, polishing his boots by his cart. His burly frame was bent over, scrubbing hard, though his boots already gleamed. Miss Marple tilted her head. Polishing boots twice in 2 days, trying to hide mud, perhaps. She recalled his coat, missing a brass button, and his glare at Potts at the auction. Harold had lost a prize bull to Potts last year, and grudges grew deep in St. Mary Mead. He's got reason, she thought, but reason's not proof. At the vicarage, Miss Marple joined the vicar's wife for tea. Mrs. Clement was full of talk about the murder. "They're saying Tom's guilty," she said, passing a scone. "But I saw Eliza Dalloway near the barn that morning, carrying a basket. And Clara Henshaw was acting odd, dropping her handkerchief everywhere." Miss Marple smiled. "People do act odd when they're upset," she said. "Did you see Harold Finch?" Mrs. Clement nodded. "He was out late the night before the auction, drinking at the pub. Looked angry, too." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sorting clues. The boot print didn't fit Tom or Harold, but Eliza wore boots sometimes, not just clogs. Clara's feet were tiny, but her linseed oil purchase nagged at Miss Marple. Oil could clean a pitchfork handle, hiding fingerprints. And that scrap of paper in the barn, with Clara's handwriting about pay by Friday, screamed blackmail. Too many threads, Miss Marple thought, but they'll come together. She visited the village shop next, where Mrs. Price was stacking jars. "Harold Finch bought polish yesterday," Mrs. Price said, unprompted. "Said his boots got muddy. Funny, they looked clean to me." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on a display of buttons. One matched the brass one from the barn. Common, but telling. Harold's careless with his coat, and his temper. At the inn, Miss Marple heard more gossip. A farmer claimed Eliza had been late paying Potts for cattle, and he'd threatened to cut her off. Another said Tom's sack of coins was found under his bed, wrapped in butcher's paper. "That's Eliza's paper," the farmer said. Miss Marple's needles paused in her mind. "Butcher's paper's common. It's not enough." She thought of the pitchfork scratches, likely from a ring. Harold wore a signet ring, but Eliza didn't. Clara's hands were bare, and Tom's too. The ring matters, Miss Marple thought. She also recalled Eliza's cut finger, fresh and sharp, like from a tool. A pitchfork's not easy to wield, she mused. It takes strength and leaves marks. As dusk settled, Miss Marple walked home, her shawl tight against the chill. The village was quiet, but secrets hummed under the surface. Tom's coins were a false scent, she was sure. Too obvious, too neat. Harold's polished boots and missing button were suspicious, but the boot print didn't fit. Eliza's nerves and muddy apron pointed somewhere, and Clara's letter hinted at blackmail. Too many threads, Miss Marple thought, but they'll come together. At her cottage, she lit the fire and took out her knitting. The clues were like stitches: boot print, button, scratches, letter, oil. Each one small, but together they'd form a pattern. "People think they can hide," she murmured, smiling faintly, "but they always leave something behind." She'd keep watching, listening, and knitting. The truth was close, waiting to be found.
Chapter 5. Tangled Threads. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village's stone cottages.
3 days after Reginald Potts's murder at the livestock auction, the air buzzed with whispers, like bees in a hive. Miss Jane Marple sat in her neat parlor, her knitting needles clicking steadily, but her sharp blue eyes were far away, sorting through the clues she'd gathered. The muddy boot print, the brass button, the scratches on the pitchfork, Clara's blackmail letter, Eliza's cut finger, Harold's polished boots, Tom's sack of coins. Each was a thread in a messy tangle, and Miss Marple was determined to untie it. She decided to start the day with a visit to Mrs. Eliza Dalloway. The butcher shop was quiet, its counter gleaming under Eliza's nervous scrubbing. Miss Marple stepped inside, her smile warm. "Good morning, Eliza," she said. "Such a trying time, isn't it?" Eliza's round face twitched, her hands gripping a cloth. "Trying? It's a nightmare, Miss Marple. All this talk about murder." Her voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noticed the cut on her finger again, now scabbed but still fresh, like from a sharp tool. "Mind if I have a cup of tea with you?" Miss Marple asked. "It settles the nerves." Eliza hesitated, then nodded, leading her to a small back room. As she poured tea, her hands shook, splashing a drop on the table. Miss Marple sipped, her eyes soft but watchful. "You were at the auction early, weren't you? Must have been busy with deliveries." Eliza's cup rattled. "Just dropping off meat for the stalls, nothing else." Miss Marple nodded, but she thought of Eliza's muddy apron and that cut. "Pitchforks are tricky," she said, almost to herself. "They can slip and nick you." Eliza paled, her fingers tightening on her cup. "I don't use pitchforks," she snapped. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind turning. Eliza's scared, she thought, but of what? Guilt or something else? The boot print in the barn nagged at her, small, like a woman's, and Eliza sometimes wore boots, not just clogs. But the pitchfork scratches suggested a ring, and Eliza wore none. "It doesn't quite fit," Miss Marple murmured. She headed to the market square, where the barn stood silent. Slipping past the rope, she studied the scene again. The boot print was fading but still clear, too small for Harold Finch or Tom Carver. The hay trail to the side door caught her eye again. Someone had left in a hurry. She also recalled the scrap of paper with Clara's handwriting. "Pay by Friday, or I tell." Blackmail was a strong motive, but Clara's frail frame couldn't wield a pitchfork. Someone else was here, Miss Marple thought. At the Blue Boar Inn, she settled into her corner with a pot of tea. The barmaid was quick to share gossip. "They're saying Harold Finch was out late before the auction, drinking and muttering about pots, and his wife says he came home with a torn coat." Miss Marple's needles paused in her mind. The brass button in the barn. Harold's coat was missing one. Men are so careless, she thought, but is it too obvious? She learned more. Tom Carver's mother had visited the inn, defending her son. The sack of coins, she had said, was payment for extra work, not stolen. Miss Marple nodded. That explains the coins, a false lead. But Tom's nervous glances still puzzled her. Was he hiding something else? Miss Marple decided to check on Harold Finch. She found him at the sheep pens, his burly frame leaning against a fence. His boots shone, polished again, and his signet ring glinted in the sun. "Morning, Mr. Finch," she called, her voice sweet. "Fine day for checking your flock." Harold grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Not so fine with all this murder talk. I had nothing to do with pots." Miss Marple smiled. "Of course. But it's odd, isn't it? A button missing from your coat." Harold's hand went to his sleeve, then dropped. "Lost it weeks ago," he muttered. She left him, her mind buzzing. Harold's ring could have scratched the pitchfork, and his missing button matched the one in the barn. But the boot print was wrong. His feet were too big. She thought, he's part of it, but not alone. She recalled Eliza's nerves, Clara's letter, and Tom's fear.
The clues were piling up, but they didn't yet match. Back at the inn, she overheard a farmer mention a new detail. Eliza had been seen washing her boots the morning after the murder, scrubbing them clean by the pump. Trying to hide mud, she thought. She also heard that Clara had been spotted near the barn the night before the auction, carrying a small bottle, linseed oil perhaps. Cleaning a pitchfork, Miss Marple wondered, but Clara's strength was lacking. As evening fell, Miss Marple walked home, the village quiet under a pink sky. The clues swirled in her mind. The boot print, likely Eliza's. The button, likely Harold's. The scratches from a ring pointing to Harold. Clara's blackmail note, Tom's cleared coins. Two people maybe, she thought. One to distract, one to strike. The pattern was forming, but a piece was missing. At her cottage, she lit the fire and took out her knitting. The needles clicked, steady as her thoughts. People think they're clever, she murmured, but they leave traces. She'd keep watching, every glance, every slip, every lie. The truth was close, hidden in the everyday, and Miss Marple was very good at finding it.
Chapter 6. A Misstep in the Dance. The fourth day after Reginald Potts's murder dawned gray and damp in St. Mary Mead. A fine mist clung to the village, softening the outlines of the stone cottages and muffling the clatter of morning chores. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking softly, her sharp blue eyes watching the world outside. The village was restless, and she knew restless people made mistakes, small ones, but enough to unravel a mystery. Her mind turned over the clues, the muddy boot prints, the brass button, the pitchfork scratches, Clara's blackmail note, Eliza's cut finger, Harold's polished boots, and Tom's cleared sack of coins. The pattern was close, but something was off, like a dropped stitch. Constable Harrow was making noise about arresting Tom Carver. A new clue had surfaced. A scrap of paper found in Potts's pocket, torn from a ledger, with the initials E.D. scrawled in ink. Harrow was sure it pointed to Eliza Dalloway, the butcher's wife. She owed him money, he told a crowd at the Blue Boar Inn. Those initials seal it. Miss Marple, sipping tea in her corner, shook her head. Too neat, she murmured. She recognized the handwriting. It was Clara Henshaw's, not Eliza's. A plant to throw us off. She decided to visit Clara again. The spinster's cottage was tidy, its garden bare under the mist. Clara opened the door, her thin face paler than ever, her handkerchief twisted tight. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice shaky. "Why are you here?" Miss Marple smiled, kind but firm. "Just a chat, Clara. This murder's upset us all." Over tea, she steered the talk to Potts. Clara's eyes darted away. "He was cruel. He wanted my cottage, said he'd tell everyone about my brother's debts if I didn't pay." Miss Marple nodded. "And that letter in his pocket? Your writing, wasn't it?" Clara froze, then nodded. "I wrote it, but I didn't plant it there, I swear." Miss Marple believed her. Clara's frail hands couldn't grip a pitchfork, and her tiny feet didn't match the boot print. Someone used her note, Miss Marple thought, to point fingers elsewhere. But who? She headed to the barn, slipping past the rope with her usual quiet step. The air inside was damp, the dark stain of Potts's blood now faint. The boot print was still there, small and clear. She studied the pitchfork, propped against a bale. The scratches on the handle, faint marks from a ring, stood out. Harold's signet ring, she thought, but the boot print didn't fit his big feet. She noticed something new, a smudge of linseed oil on a nearby crate, faint but sharp. "Clara's oil," she murmured, recalling the spinster's purchase. Used to clean the pitchfork? But Clara wasn't strong enough. Someone else, Miss Marple thought, working with her note. The hay trail to the side door was trampled now, but it still hinted at a quick exit. She stepped outside, her shawl tight against the damp. At the village shop, Mrs. Price was stacking tins, her tongue loose with gossip.
Eliza Dalloway was washing her boots again this morning. Looked frantic, like she was hiding something. Miss Marple nodded, thinking of Eliza's muddy apron and cut finger. "And Harold Finch?" she asked. Mrs. Price shrugged. "Heard he was bragging at the pub last night, saying he's glad Potts is gone. His wife wasn't happy. Said he came home late the night before the auction, coat torn." Miss Marple's mind clicked like her needles. Harold's missing button, his ring, his polished boots, they all pointed to him. But the boot print screamed someone else. She recalled Eliza's nerves, her cut finger, her boots. 2 people, she thought. One to lure Potts, one to strike. She decided to check the auction records at the village hall, where Mr. Grayson, the auctioneer, kept his books. Grayson was there, his bald head shining as he sorted papers. "Dreadful business," he said when Miss Marple asked about Potts. He was always pushing people. Tom, Eliza, even Harold. He paused. "Eliza delivered meat to the barn that morning, early. Said she saw Potts there, arguing with someone." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did she say who?" Grayson shook his head. "She clammed up after that." Back at the inn, Miss Marple sipped tea, her mind weaving. The ledger scrap was a misstep. Someone wanted Eliza blamed, but Clara's handwriting gave it away. Harold's ring and button were damning, but the boot print likely belonged to Eliza. Tom's coins were a false lead, and Clara's weakness ruled her out. A dance of clues, Miss Marple thought, but someone's out of step. As evening fell, the mist thickened, cloaking St. Mary Mead in gray. Miss Marple walked home, her shoes tapping softly. The village was quiet, but secrets whispered in the fog. "People think they're clever," she murmured, "but they trip over their own lies." She'd keep watching. Every glance, every slip. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight.
Chapter 7. A Glimmer of Truth. The 5th day after Reginald Potts's murder brought a crisp breeze to St. Mary Mead, sweeping away the mist and leaving the village bright under a pale sun. The market square, once alive with the livestock auction's bustle, was quiet now, but whispers of the crime lingered like dust. Miss Jane Marple attended the village fete, her knitting bag at her side, her sharp blue eyes scanning the crowd. The fete was a cheerful affair, bunting strung across the square, tables laden with jams and cakes, but tension hung beneath the smiles. Murder had a way of souring even the sweetest gatherings. Miss Marple stood by a stall selling knitted scarves, her fingers brushing the wool as she watched the suspects. Tom Carver lingered at the edge, his lanky frame hunched, avoiding eyes. He slipped a small package to his mother, wrapped in butcher paper. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Interesting, she thought. Eliza's paper, perhaps? Eliza Dalloway was at her own stall, her round face tight as she handed out meat pies, her hand still shaky. Harold Finch laughed loudly near the cider tent, but his eyes darted, uneasy. Clara Henshaw hovered near the church stall, her thin hands clutching a handkerchief. As Miss Marple bought a jar of gooseberry jam, she noticed Clara drop her handkerchief near the barn's side door. She shuffled over, picking it up with a smile. "Yours, Clara?" she asked, handing it back. Clara flushed, nodding quickly. The cloth was damp, smelling faintly of linseed oil. "Polishing furniture again?" Miss Marple said lightly. Clara stammered. Yes, just that." But Miss Marple's mind clicked. Oil for a pitchfork handle, she thought. But Clara's too weak to strike. She moved through the fete, her ears open. A farmer's wife mentioned seeing Eliza near the barn at dawn on the murder day, her boots muddy. Another villager said Harold had been polishing his boots again, his signet ring glinting as he scrubbed. Miss Marple recalled the pitchfork scratches, marks from a ring, likely Harold's. The brass button from the barn matched his coat, too. But the boot print, small and neat, pointed elsewhere. Eliza's boots, she thought.
She wore her husband's old pair to the auction. At the tea tent, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Price, the shopkeeper, who was full of gossip. She said, "Tom's mother swears those coins were his wages, not stolen at all." Miss Marple nodded. "That clears Tom," she thought. "But why's he so nervous?" She also heard that Eliza had been seen washing her boots yet again, scrubbing hard by the pump. "Hiding mud," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Price leaned closer, and Harold was boasting at the fete, saying he's better off without pots. His wife looked cross, said he was out late before the murder, coat torn. Miss Marple's needles clicked in her mind. The clues were aligning. The boot print, likely Eliza's, the button and ring scratches pointing to Harold, Clara's linseed oil and blackmail note, a misdirection, Tom's coins, a false lead. Two people, she thought, Eliza to lure, Harold to strike. But why plant Clara's note? She needed one more piece. She visited the barn again, slipping past the rope. The boot print was faint now, but still small, definitely Eliza's size. The hay trail to the side door was trampled, but a fresh clue caught her eye. A tiny smear of blood on a crate, not Potts's, but newer, like from a cut. Eliza's finger, she thought, recalling the butcher's wife's scabbed cut. She was here, and she was careless. Back at the fete, Miss Marple watched Harold again. His loud laugh was forced, his eyes scanning the crowd. He caught her gaze and looked away, his hand brushing his coat, still missing a button. He's nervous, she thought, and he should be. She also saw Tom, his stutter worse as he spoke to a farmer. Not guilt, she decided, just fear of being blamed. As the fete wound down, Miss Marple walked home, the sun dipping low. The village glowed, but secrets simmered. The boot print, button, scratches, oil, and blood smear were stitching together. Eliza and Harold, she thought. They worked together, but someone tried to frame Clara. The ledger scrap with ED was too clever, a trick to point at Eliza, but Clara's handwriting gave it away. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and took out her knitting. The needles clicked, steady as her thoughts. "People think they can hide," she murmured, "but they leave trails." The pattern was clear now, but she needed proof. She'd watch closer tomorrow, every slip, every lie. The truth was shining through, and Miss Marple was ready to catch it.
Chapter 8. The Net Tightens. The 6th day after Reginald Potts's murder broke clear and cold in St. Mary Mead, the village waking under a pale blue sky. Frost dusted the cobblestones, and chimneys puffed smoke into the crisp air. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, her sharp blue eyes lost in thought. The clues were knitting together. Muddy boot print, brass button, pitchfork scratches, Clara's blackmail note, Eliza's cut finger, Harold's polished boots, and a smear of blood in the barn. The pattern was nearly complete, but one last stitch was needed to tie it tight. Miss Marple decided to visit Tom Carver's mother, Mrs. Carver, who lived in a small cottage near the church. The widow's face was worn, her hands rough from years of work. "Tom's no thief," she said, her voice firm as she poured tea. "Those coins were his pay for extra jobs at the auction. Potts owed him, not the other way round." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind. "I believe you," she said. "Tom's nervous, though. Is he hiding something else?" Mrs. Carver hesitated, then shook her head. "Just scared to be blamed. He saw something that morning, near the barn, but won't say what." Miss Marple's mind clicked. Tom's a witness, she thought, not a killer. The boot print was too small for his feet, and the coins were a false trail. She thanked Mrs. Carver and headed to the village square, her shawl snug against the chill. The barn stood quiet, its rope barrier sagging. She slipped inside, her eyes sweeping the dirt floor. The boot print was barely visible now, but its size, small, like a woman's, still pointed to Eliza Dalloway. The blood smear on the crate,
fresh and not Potts's, matched Eliza's cut finger. She was here, she murmured, and she was careless. She re-examined the pitchfork, propped against a bale. The scratches on the handle, from a ring, screamed Harold Finch. His signet ring was well known, and his coat was missing a brass button, just like the one found near Potts's body. Harold struck, she thought, but Eliza helped. The hay trail to the side door hinted at a quick escape, likely both of them. At the Blue Boar Inn, Miss Marple settled into her corner with a pot of tea. Jenny, the barmaid, leaned close, her voice low. "They're saying Eliza was arguing with Potts the night before the auction, at the pub, loud as anything, and Harold was there too, drinking hard." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking in her mind. "And Clara Henshaw?" she asked. Jenny shrugged. "She's been quiet, but someone saw her near the barn that night, carrying a bottle. Linseed oil, maybe." Miss Marple thought of Clara's blackmail note found in Potts's pocket, with E.D. scrawled to frame Eliza. The handwriting was Clara's, but her frail frame couldn't wield a pitchfork. Someone used her note, Miss Marple thought, to muddy the trail. She recalled the linseed oil smell on Clara's handkerchief. Cleaning the pitchfork, but not striking. She decided to check the village hall, where auction records were kept. Mr. Grayson was there, his bald head bent over a ledger. "Eliza owed Potts a lot," he said when Miss Marple asked. "She paid him the morning of the auction, though, said it was settled." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "In the barn?" Grayson nodded. "She met him there, early, looked upset after." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Eliza lured Potts, she thought. Harold was waiting. Back at the inn, she overheard a farmer mention Harold's wife, who'd complained about his late nights. "He came home muddy before the auction," the farmer said, "and his coat was torn." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The button, the ring, the polished boots. Harold was careless. But the boot print and blood smear pointed to Eliza. They worked together, she thought. Eliza to draw him in, Harold to kill. As dusk fell, Miss Marple walked home, the village quiet under the fading light. The clues were tight now. Eliza's boot print and cut finger, Harold's button and ring scratches, Clara's note as a false lead, Tom's innocence. "They planned it," she murmured, "but they tripped. The ledger scrap was meant to frame Eliza, but Clara's handwriting betrayed the trick. Clever, but not clever enough." At her cottage, she lit the fire and took out her knitting. The needles clicked, steady as her thoughts. "People leave traces," she said softly, "even when they think they're safe." The net was closing, and tomorrow she'd pull it tight. She'd gather them all, Tom, Eliza, Harold, and Clara, and let the truth spill out. The pattern was clear, and Miss Marple was ready to show it.
Chapter 9. The Revelation. The 7th evening after Reginald Potts's murder cast a soft glow over St. Mary Mead, the village settling into a quiet hush as lamplight flickered in cottage windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting untouched, her sharp blue eyes bright with purpose. The clues had woven together, muddy boot print, brass button, pitchfork scratches, Clara's blackmail note, Eliza's cut finger, Harold's polished boots, and a blood smear in the barn. The pattern was clear, and tonight she'd unravel it. She invited the suspects, Tom Carver, Eliza Dalloway, Harold Finch, and Clara Henshaw, to the Blue Boar Inn, along with Constable Harrow. The inn's private room was cozy, with a crackling fire and wooden tables, but the air was thick with tension. Tom sat hunched, his lanky frame tense, his stutter silent, but his eyes wide. Eliza gripped a teacup, her round face pale, her cut finger hidden in her lap. Harold leaned back, his burly arms crossed, his signet ring glinting, but his forced grin faltered. Clara twisted her handkerchief, her thin face drawn, her eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple stood, her small figure commanding despite her gentle smile. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice calm. Mr. Potts's murder has troubled us all, but the truth is simple when you see it. People leave traces, you know, even when they think they're clever." Constable Harrow frowned, his notebook open. "Miss Marple, I've got my eye on Tom, or maybe Eliza. That ledger scrap with ED is proof." She shook her head. "The scrap was a trick, Constable. The handwriting was Clara's, not Eliza's." Clara gasped, her handkerchief dropping. "I didn't kill him!" she cried. Miss Marple nodded Clara. "I know. You wrote to Potts about his blackmail. Pay by Friday, or I tell. But someone else used your note to mislead us." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "He wanted my cottage. I only wrote to scare him." Miss Marple turned to the others. "The barn tells the real story. A muddy boot print, small like a woman's. Yours, Eliza." Eliza's cup rattled. "I was there, delivering meat," she stammered. "Nothing more." Miss Marple continued. "You wore your husband's old boots, didn't you? They left that print. And your cut finger, fresh from gripping a pitchfork, perhaps." Eliza's face went white, her hands shaking. She turned to Harold. "And you, Mr. Finch, your coat was missing a brass button found near Potts's body. Your signet ring scratched the pitchfork's handle when you struck." Harold's grin vanished. "That's nonsense," he barked. "I was with my sheep." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Your boots were polished too often, hiding mud. And your wife said you came home late, coat torn, the night before." The room was silent, save for the fire's crackle. Miss Marple's voice was steady. "Eliza, you owed Potts money. You lured him to the barn promising to pay. Harold, you hated him for outbidding his bull. You hid nearby and struck with the pitchfork. Together, you planned it." Eliza sobbed, her head dropping. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted to scare him. He was ruining us." Harold glared, his fists clenched. "You've got no proof," he growled. Miss Marple raised her hand. "The boot print is Eliza's. The button and scratches are yours, Harold. The blood smear on the crate, Eliza's, from her cut finger. And Clara's note was planted to frame her, but your haste gave you away." Tom, silent till now, spoke up, his stutter faint. I saw them, Miss Marple. They were near the barn, early. I was too scared to tell." Eliza broke down, tears streaming. "It was Harold's idea. Potts was bleeding us dry. My shop, his business. We just wanted him gone." Harold slumped, his face gray. "He deserved it," he muttered, "but we didn't plan to kill." Constable Harrow stood, his notebook snapping shut. "That's enough," he said. "You're both coming with me." Miss Marple stepped back, her work done. The room emptied as Harrow led Eliza and Harold away, Clara following, still clutching her handkerchief. Tom lingered, his eyes grateful. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he whispered. She smiled. "Truth always comes out, Tom." As the inn quieted, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap. The village would talk for weeks, but the pattern was complete. "People," she murmured, "are so predictable." The truth had been there, in the small things, and she'd found it, as always.
Chapter 10. Tea and Truth. The morning after the dramatic revelation at the Blue Boar Inn, St. Mary Mead woke to a soft, golden light. The village seemed to sigh with relief, as if the air itself was lighter now that Reginald Potts' murder was solved. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, a fire crackling in the hearth, her knitting needles resting in her lap. A teapot steamed on the table, and Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, sat across from her, her kind face eager for details. The village was buzzing, but Miss Marple preferred to explain things quietly, over a cup of tea. "It's quite simple, really," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "People leave traces, like threads in a pattern. You just have to follow them." Mrs. Clement leaned forward, her eyes wide. "But how did you know, Jane?" Eliza and Harold, such an unlikely pair. Miss Marple smiled, her sharp blue eyes twinkling. Human nature, my dear, it's always the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or London. She sipped her tea, then began. Eliza Dalloway owed Potts money for cattle, and he was pressing her hard. Her butcher shop was struggling, and she was desperate. Harold Finch, meanwhile, hated Potts for outbidding him on a prize bull, a blow to his pride and his purse. They both had reasons, but neither could act alone. Mrs. Clement nodded, passing a plate of scones. So they worked together? Exactly, Miss Marple said. Eliza lured Potts to the barn, promising to settle her debt. She wore her husband's old boots, small enough to leave that muddy print I found. Harold was waiting, hidden in the shadows. He struck with the pitchfork, his signet ring scratching the handle as he gripped it. She paused, buttering a scone. The brass button from his coat tore off in the struggle, left near Potts' body. Mrs. Clement gasped. And that blood smear in the barn? Miss Marple's needles clicked in her mind. Eliza's, from a cut on her finger. Pitchforks are heavy, and she likely helped steady it. She was careless, leaving that smear on a crate. Mrs. Clement shook her head. But what about Clara's note, the one with ED on it? A clever trick, Miss Marple said. Clara Henshaw wrote to Potts, threatening to expose his blackmail over her brother's debts. Harold and Eliza found the note and planted it in Potts' pocket, adding ED to point at Eliza and confuse things. But Clara's handwriting gave them away. I'd seen it on church lists. She sipped her tea. They hoped to frame Clara, or at least muddy the trail. Mrs. Clement frowned. And Tom Carver? Everyone thought he was guilty. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Poor Tom! His sack of coins was just wages, as his mother said. He was nervous because he saw Eliza and Harold near the barn that morning, but was too scared to speak. Youthful nerves, not guilt. The fire popped, and Miss Marple leaned back. The clues were small. Boot print, button, scratches, blood, note. Everyday things, but they told the story. Eliza's muddy apron and cut finger, Harold's polished boots and torn coat, Clara's linseed oil to clean the pitchfork. They thought they'd covered their tracks, but people are never as clever as they think. Mrs. Clement sighed. You make it sound so simple, Jane. Miss Marple smiled. It's like knitting, my dear. Pull one thread, and the pattern unravels. She picked up her needles, their soft clicks filling the room. Outside, St. Mary Mead hummed with its usual rhythm, children laughing, carts rattling, neighbors chatting. The auction was a memory, the murder solved, and the village was itself again. As Mrs. Clement left, promising to spread the tale, with some embellishments, no doubt, Miss Marple settled by the window. The golden light bathed her garden, and she thought of Eliza and Harold, now in Constable Harrow's custody. Desperation makes fools of us all, she murmured. Her needles moved steadily, stitching a new row. The truth had come out, as it always did, hidden in the little things she was so good at noticing.